basically just the workflow overview and just the logic of After Effects. I find that when I'm teaching this, it really helps to just give people these big pieces so they can understand what to do. So if you haven't yet, make sure you download and maybe print out this little checklist of things we're going to go over. And then I also have keyboard shortcuts for you, these super important ones. I don't know about you, but whenever I learn a new tool, I like to write down the keyboard shortcuts next to me so I can work and I can get really fast. With After Effects, you really want to do that because it's totally unforgiving if you don't know the keyboard shortcuts. But let me take a step back. So what we're doing here, I created this whole Fast Start series because I know there's a lot of designers out there who've wanted to be able to prototype their work at a higher level than most prototyping tools will allow. I've been teaching this for a fair number of years now, and I'll go in and I'll actually teach teams. So I got hired by Dropbox to come in and teach their UX team, just get them onboarded with After Effects. I did that with Slack. I did that with Airbnb also. So I've been teaching teams for a while now, and I have a pretty good understanding of where folks are at. So if you're watching this, maybe you've never opened it, you've been pretty intimidated, but you've seen cool stuff, and you're like, I totally want to learn how to do that, but it's just kind of overwhelming, and the tutorials out there aren't very good. So I just wanted to create this free mini course because I'm a big believer in this stuff adding a lot of value. I've also talked to folks who learned it years ago, and they remember that they used to know it, but maybe they don't quite know it so much anymore, and this is just a refresher for them. And then also there's just a lot of professional tips and best practices that I put in here, so even if you know it, I think you're going to learn some cool stuff and get some value out of it. Now, before I jump in, I just want to answer the question why After Effects? Why do I think it's a cool tool to use? And I always say, look, I don't push it. I'm all about the right tool for the job. And for me personally, After Effects has been great because I love to be able to prototype at an infinite level and be able to have complete control over what I do. So for me, it's a great tool of choice. And now you can export 3 classes of assets out to engineers, the actual video files, GIFs, and then JSON files, and they can just put those right into the actual product itself, which is really cool. So there's a lot of value there, and one of the things I've learned is just it really helps to be fast at this tool. So I'll be giving you tips to speed you up and remove friction, and then I'll also just help you build velocity and momentum because it's really fun, and it's not as hard as people think it is, and I think you're going to see that right now when we jump in. Let me show you some cool stuff just real quick. So if you have no context and you're what are we talking about? So check it out. So a site like Dribbble, you can search for GIFs, and almost all of these GIFs are made in After Effects. It's really amazing, and they have tons and tons of views. People love them. Projects like this where you can just do amazing stuff, really, in terms of animation and just showing a concept, a really high fidelity way of showing a concept. Also, this pull to refresh, really popular. It has tons and tons of views. People love this stuff. It's really cool. Doing icons, you can just export this stuff, again, as a JSON file, and you can have complete control. I think that's amazing. Also, just with this Lottie framework, which is a framework that Airbnb developed, which lets you take your files from After Effects and put them directly into a product. People are using this, big names. These ones from Google are amazing, and these are using vector assets in After Effects. They just animated really well, and then they can export those and drop them right into the product. Walgreens is using this stuff on their onboarding videos. There's just actual there's Target, actual big companies are using this. So it's a good tool to know if you're at that place on your team and you want to be able to do this kind of stuff. So I just want to show you that. So okay, so let's get started with this project. So again, I'm going to refer back to this document here, and we're going to go through step by step. So I'm going to launch, and these are all down here. I also have this source file. It's a PSD that you can use, and we'll be doing this. So if you want, you can download this and follow along as well if you want. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just open up After Effects so you can see it out of the box. And the first thing I'm going to do is that we're going to just set up a custom workspace. Before I even go through the logic of the whole thing, there are so many palettes and just weird things inside of After Effects that have no relevance, and they're honestly pretty overwhelming. So rather than go through and explain like, this palette does this, but it's completely useless to you, we're just gonna close down everything and make a custom workspace. So this is After Effects like out of the box. This may be kind of close to what yours will look like. There's all these palettes over here. I'm gonna want you to just close all these down. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna control click on these titles here, and I'm just control click, I'm gonna do close panel, tracker, paint. I mean, you're never gonna use these things. Brushes, motion sketching, gone, smoother, gone, wiggler, gone. And I mean, rather than really going through all these things, you know, it's just not worth it. So libraries, we can close that, effects and presets, audio, info. So I just closed everything out. And eventually later on in this mini course, I'll recommend some plugins that you might want to get. But for now, we're just going to close it out entirely. And so it's just there. So now we'll go up to Window, Workspace, and we're going to save this as a new workspace. So just go under Window, Workspace, and then save as new workspace, and let's call this like UI animation. That way, if things get reset, you can always go back to that, and it's just clean, and you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so now let's go through, now we've cleaned this up, so it's not crazy looking. Let's go through just these steps here, just explaining the logic of the tool, because I think when you get the logic of how it works, it'll allow you to compartmentalize, you know, where, like the things that are easy to do versus the things that you need to invest a little bit more time on to really master. So here's how it works. So number one, we import our files into After Effects. This is like the first step. So there's a couple things you need to know here. So I'm just going through this list here. So all of your imported design assets are externally linked files, just like placed files in Illustrator, but not like embedded files in like Illustrator. If you haven't used like Illustrator, don't worry, I'll totally show you what this means. When you import them, they will be found in your project window. So let's check this out. So because it's a linked file, and there's several ways you can import a project here. So I'll show you those right now. So if I bring up my desktop real quick, and I have this PSD, I can literally just drag this over into After Effects. Now what'll happen is you'll get a dialog pop-up here, and there's a couple things you just want to note here. So of these options here, there are always three in the import kind. There's footage, composition, and composition retain layer sizes. Almost always do composition retain layer sizes. If you don't, it'll just cause like if it comes in as composition, it'll cause you major problems. So just do composition retain layer sizes, and you can choose to have like editable layer styles. All it means is that if it comes in from Photoshop, which you may or may not be doing, and I'll show you different workflows for that, is that if it does have layer styles, you can choose to preserve those. So I'll bring that in. Let me show you a couple other ways real quick before I explain this. So you can also do Command I with this palette selected here. So Command I, and then you can select your file, and then the dialog appears here. So we'll do composition retain layer sizes, and I'll hit open. And then for some inexplicable reason, you'll hear me badmouth After Effects a lot. It's a love-hate relationship, believe me. So one of the annoying things is you then reconfirm the things you just said that you wanted, which is always awesome from a UX perspective. And then lastly, you can also you can right-click in this palette here, you can go File, Import, and then you can also go up to the top here and go File, Import, Files. So there's like a million ways. I think I just showed you 4. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to import this now again. So I covered that. Okay. So here's my thing here. Now we're talking about linked files here. So if I save this project and I'm like, we'll call this fast start down here. I'm like, cool. Okay. Now check this out. So this PSD that we brought in is 15 megs. This fast start here is 78K, right? So this file is not in here. It is literally linked to this. So keep that in mind. This will be a smaller file size. This is not embedded. What that means is if I change this master file here, call it like fast start 2, and I go back to After Effects, it just broke my links. So it's links to it. You can relink stuff in After Effects, but it is a pain, and it's honestly not very smart. And so it's better just to not do that. So you'll see that now you get this weird, if I show you, you just get this weird thing that says, hey, it's broken. So what I'll probably do, I'm just going to delete all this, go back here, undo that, go back to After Effects, right? So these are just things that I want to keep you aware of so that you don't do these and make it really hard on yourself. Now, what people will sometimes also do is they'll change the location. So if I put this in a folder, say, this asset here, again, it will also break the link. So just a couple things to be aware of there, that you don't want to be moving files around, you don't want to be renaming them, or else it'll break the link. And yes, you can relink them, but it's just honestly better if you don't, if you just don't do that. So now that we covered that, that's an important logical thing to be aware of. So now I'm just going to re-import this again. Okay, that's all we did. We just imported a file. Awesome. So that's the first thing, importing your file. Number 2, compositions. I can pull this up here so I'm not just waving this PDF around that you can't see. So let me pull this up here. Okay, so that was this here, import your file. Let's check it out. Compositions. Compositions are like layer groups in Photoshop. And again, if you're not used to working in Photoshop or like Illustrator, don't worry. It's just a familiar metaphor for some people. Think of them like a musical composition. So a musical composition has multiple like tracks that are all doing stuff, not like a visual composition. They use this word composition and it just means different things to different people. I think it's important to just be aware of that. So it's less of a static visual composition, more like a dynamic musical composition, meaning that there's time and there's layers and so forth. And those layers contain keyframes, and they can be nested into other layer timelines, and those timelines are basically called compositions. And so you can put a composition into another composition, do that, make really complicated structural things that you don't need to worry about right now because I don't want to overwhelm you, but you can do that. Your project can have unlimited compositions. So let's check this out. So you'll notice that when I imported my project file, there's essentially 3 kinds of things you will only ever see in this project window here. This project window is just your library. That's all it is. It's where all your assets live, and you can like organize that, make folders and all that cool stuff. So you'll see that there are what are called like footage items here, which are just assets. So they can be JPEGs or Illustrator files or movies. It's just footage. After Effects doesn't care. It's just like, okay, like, you can bring in a PDF or a GIF. It's just a thing to After Effects. The other kind of item you'll see is folders. So there's like a new folder button here, and you can make a new folder and you can name it and keep your stuff organized that way. Pretty obvious. I don't think I need to explain folders to you. And then there's compositions. You can see the icon here. It just has this icon here. So if I click that, I'm inside the composition now. And what this is it has a timeline and a canvas. And I can have numerous compositions. I can also duplicate them. So if I hit Command D, I can make a new one here, and I can duplicate it and modify. And that's a way of working really fast and doing lots of variations in After Effects is if you duplicate your work and then tweak it, render that out. You can do lots of cool versioning that way. But for now, we'll just know that we have our canvas here and our timeline. So the canvas is the canvas, right? Like we're all familiar, it's just the visual representation of things. So it has layers, you can click and drag them. It has snapping. Make sure you have snapping turned on. That's really cool because then you can click and it will just snap to points really, really fast. So you don't have to worry about that. It's a really nice feature. Okay, so the timeline, let's cover the timeline. Timeline is where you'll be doing most of your work here. So timeline is layers based, just like in Photoshop, and is where your design assets will be animated. You will be setting your work area as you build your motion. Okay, so I'm introducing a couple different concepts here. So the first thing I want to go over is this is your timeline, and there's just a playback head, and you can just click and drag this. Now, yours may look like this, meaning it's in time code, which is a weird thing. I prefer to work in frames. I highly recommend you also work in frames. So what you can do is just command click in here and it just toggles it between frames and time code. Time code is weird. Frames are great because knowing the frame numbers, you can then convert standard like timing things, like Google Material Motion has their standard timing. You can convert those over to frames and actually have those resources. That'll convert over to frames, and then you can just block things out, and then it'll be like industry standard timing and duration, which is really, really cool. Another thing to be aware of is if you hit Command K, it brings up your composition settings. Now, something to be aware of, After Effects has a frame rate, meaning that you can change that. So most people I know tend to work at 60 frames a second. Yours may default to like 24 when you open it. You can just change it here. Some folks like 120. There's not, at a certain point, it doesn't matter a whole lot. The most common ones I have seen are like 24, 30, 50, 60, and 120. So you can just choose those. I work at 60, and so numbers I give you and stuff will probably be, they'll be at 60 frames a second. Okay, so that's the composition settings there, and you'll see that this file here, if I pop this open in Photoshop real quick, so a great keyboard shortcut is if you select your footage in After Effects and you hit Command E, it will actually open that in the native program, which I just did that. And if we look at this file real quick, we'll see that there's just a nav bar. This is just a screenshot from my app just to show you how to do this real quick. So, and I just chopped these layers out really fast. I didn't design this, so there's just a nav bar up here. There's the list view, and then there's the message view here. And I'm gonna show you how to work with that. So, but the cool thing is you can see that this is a layered file and a composition, and just came in through one-to-one in like After Effects. So if I view my canvas size, I don't know why it's in inches, it's 1125 pixels by 2001 pixels, and it seems like a weird size to me. But if I go to my canvas here, it's the exact same size here. Boom, that's awesome. So it's all one-to-one. It's very, very clean, and now you can work with that. Okay, so that's the timeline. The timeline is where you'll be doing most of your work, and it's layers based. Okay, so we've talked about this. These are layers here. It's just like a stack of like items, and essentially the concept is, just the logic of this is that we're going to be doing animation down here using keyframes. But check this out. So you'll notice that in my case, the timeline is actually 1,000 frames long, and if I put that in actual time code and I zoom out, it's like 16 seconds long, and you can change this duration, no problem. But the idea is that we're working in like, pretty small units of time because it's UX UI prototyping. So we may just be working in something that's like, really, really small here. So when I play it back, I want to be able to just play back a selection of time. So After Effects has a really cool feature that's called the work area. And the way that works, and it's from the keyboard shortcut, B and end for beginning and N for end, I guess. If you hit B, this thing crops, it just moves over here to where your playback head is. And if I move my playback head out and I hit N for end, I now have this little selection here. And if I hit spacebar, it will just preview that region, and I can slide that around. I can trim the in and out of this thing if I grab the right thing, and I can do that. And so that's just a way of working that I want you to start thinking about, that you have your whole timeline, but you're really typically working in like little selections of time, and then you can just, preview that, and spacebar and just preview that. So that's the idea, is that we have our whole timeline, but we're just working in a selection of time. Really, really simple ideas here. Okay, now we're going to introduce some bigger concepts. So we're going to talk about keyframes and layer properties. So going back to our document here, keyframes and layer properties. The concept, the logical concept, by creating and editing keyframes on your layer properties, you create animation. Keyframes are markers in time that hold values. When you change these values, animation happens. Keyframes are alive and can be modified at any time. Okay, lots of ideas to unpack here. Don't worry about it. I know it's starting to get a little intense, but it's going to be cool. Trust me. Okay, so by creating and editing keyframes on our layer properties, what are layer properties? All right, let's check this out. So every layer here, if you twirl down this little triangle, you'll see this little transform dialog. If you twirl that down again and you just click this, it just drops down, you'll see that we have what are called layer properties. Every layer in After Effects has these same 5 properties. Pretty much all UI animation you see is like 4 of these properties, and that's it. So nobody really messes with the anchor point, I have to say. Some people do, but for the most part, nobody does. It's just position, scale, rotation, opacity. That's pretty much like 90% of what you need to know. I know it sounds crazy, but when you actually go through and start to like analyze references, you're like, oh, it's just these 4 things. So you can handle 4 things, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so these are layer properties. And these can be accessed from the keyboard. So if you hit P, you get position, S for scale, T for opacity, I think they were going for transparency, and R for rotation. And then if you hold down Shift, I could hit like Shift T, and then it adds the opacity, or I can hide it. So that's just a couple little tricks. So I'll show you a couple more that'll make it really, really easy as well. Okay, so these are layer properties that you're gonna be working with. You can see that you can also click the names here, and they have values right here. So there are values that correspond to these layer properties, right? So for example, opacity, this layer has 100% opacity, and if I, just click and drag this, it drops. I can also click in here and just type in a number, which is really, really cool for UX prototyping work, because we deal with precise things that need to go out to our engineers. So we'll know what these values are. They can be very, very specific values. Very, very important. Okay, cool. So now that we have these are layer properties, and again, they're just hidden in this little triangle right here. We don't need to go into all these switches right now. These are like 3D switches, parenting. I'll show you that in a moment. These are just the layer visibility. So if I toggle that on and off, not a big deal. This solo feature is kind of cool. This little dot right here, all it means is that if it's selected, it hides all the other layers. So that's pretty cool. And then of course you can just lock layers. So on this nav layer up here, I'm just gonna lock this down so I'm not accidentally clicking it. That's pretty much what we need to worry about for the layer properties. Let's go back here and see what other terms we introduced. All right, keyframes. This is the big thing. So you have to, we're gonna talk about keyframes now, but they're actually really, really simple. So all a keyframe is, so if I go back here and I twirl this down and say I have a position keyframe. So I have this position keyframe here. All it is if I double click it, it's just these values that we see right here. That's all it is. So it's just a marker in time. This is how I think about it. It's just the simplest way to think about it. It's just a marker in time that holds values. So here's our time, and we know we're at frame 137 at 60 frames a second, and it just holds this value. And so I can, change this value here, and because this keyframe is on this layer, if I change this, it changes the layer itself. So I can, click and drag these. I can double click and change the values. If it's selected and it's blue, I can just hit delete and then it's gone. So say I have opacity here and I have another one over here. So there's different ways of making keyframes. One way is if it's selected, you can copy and then paste it back to where the playback head is. That's cool. There's also this little like add keyframe little button here, so you can click that and that'll just add a keyframe. Also, if you have this stopwatch started, so the whole concept here is with our layer properties, we have to start the stopwatch. This little icon here is a little stopwatch. So if I change these values without the stopwatch being started, it doesn't make a keyframe, it just moves things around the canvas. So there's no animation there. I actually have to start the stopwatch. So once I start the stopwatch, it makes a keyframe here. And now if I change the values here, this will actually create the like animation right here, which is really, really, really awesome. Really simple to understand. And again, I can just move these keyframes. I can double click them. I can say like, woo, let's go 500 and put it in some weird place, and it does that. So I can just block this stuff out. It's a really, really fast way of working. Speaking of which, I have a style of working that makes it pretty fast to work with, and I call it block and time. And I'll show you how this works. And essentially the idea is that if we're building out motion here, so I'm gonna hit P for position, start the keyframe. I'm just gonna move this back here. Just go over and say I wanna put this out here. What I'm gonna do is I'm just blocking these keyframes out. So there's two styles of working. One is you work perfect from your first point further out in time. And so it's just like done basically as you're working. I prefer a faster method, which I call block and time, where I just set the keyframes exactly where I want things to go. So I know that regardless of where I am in time, the starting position of this layer is going to be here, and the end position is going to be over here. Now, once I have those, I can then slide these around in time. I can make this time shorter. I can start to ease that. But once I have these in place, it gives me a lot of ability to start to like dial this in. So that's just a cool way of working. I also showed you a cool keyboard shortcut, which is J and K. So J goes to the previous keyframe, K goes to the next one. I love that, and that's in your keyboard shortcuts. Really, really important. That's a really fun one. Okay, so we've talked about keyframes are on layer properties. They're markers in time that hold values. When you change those values, animation happens. Keyframes are live and can be modified at any time. So this is we're just covering the logical framework of doing UI like animation at this point. I'm not getting into timing. I'm not like getting into making crazy stuff at this point. All we're doing is we're just like dealing with this. So the next concept I want to introduce you to very briefly is the concept of timing. And again, we're not going to go deep into it, but timing is essentially two components. And the first one is duration, which is literally just the distance between these keyframes. Now, if you hit plus or minus, it zooms in your timeline where your playback head is. Also, you can click and drag. If you hold down the spacebar and click and drag, you can pan, which is really cool. So timing. So if I just hit the space bar and I play these back, this is the timing. If I space this out farther, it goes a lot slower. So the distance between these determines how fast or how slow it goes. If it's really close between them, it's just gonna be like that fast, right? And you can see that I'm constantly expanding and contracting this work like area here to show where I'm working. Okay, so that's one aspect of getting the timing right. And when I say timing, I mean that if you've seen like a digital product and it just like it doesn't feel right, it's too slow or it's too fast or it's too abrasive, a lot of that is just in the timing, which is the shape of the velocity curve or the actual distance between the like keyframes. So just to show you a little bit more about how this works, we're gonna design a little bit of an ease, like a bit of velocity curve. And I know that designing motion using a graph is probably not your idea of a good time, but in the last video of this fast start, I'm going to show you an amazing tool that'll just like make this very, very simple and clean and fast, and will allow you to use industry standard easing numbers on your projects, so you can just take it to your like engineers. So for just a weird reason, I'm going to control click on position, and I'm going to hit like separate dimensions. And the reason is because this position keyframe is actually like a hybrid of the X position and the Y position. And so the Y is the values that go up down, and left is, and X is left right. So I'm just gonna delete this Y position here, so I can just click this property, hit delete, and then it will unstop the stopwatch and delete those keyframes. So now I just have these X values here. And I should say, this is the only property that really has this. But I'm showing you on this because I want to show you how to actually use the handles in the graph to design like easing. Now, before I do that though, I'm going to show you a really, really cool trick. So one of the best practices I highly recommend you consider when you're working is to challenge yourself to work with as few keyframes as possible. Now, After Effects is primarily designed for motion graphics and special effects. So special effects are like if you're watching like The Walking Dead and there's like zombie makeup, they can do that in post-production using After Effects. It's really cool. Motion graphics is like a TV commercial where there's like 3D text and it's doing all this crazy stuff. Now, because I've done a lot of that work as well, I know that most people, when they're doing it, they don't think about animating with few keyframes, and the reason is it doesn't matter. You just want to make it look awesome. But with UI prototyping, there's a lot of back and forth in the design process. So you want to make your projects as lean and as easy to like edit as physically possible. It's just a mindset I want you to have. So if we're going to then build a piece of motion here where this slides over and this is attached to it, we could, of course, like animate this bottom layer here and put keyframes on there as well. So I could hit Option P, and I don't know if I showed you that, but with the properties here, if you hit Option plus the property key, so for position it's just P. If I hit Option P, it'll actually make a keyframe right there where the playback head is. It's very, very cool. So if I hit Option P, K, Option P again, I've just blocked out two keyframes. That's very, very cool. So what I could do is I could grab this layer then, scooch it over to the right, and then they'll both come in together. That would be one way to make this happen, but I have 4 keyframes here. What if I could do it in 2? That would be pretty cool, because then if there was any tweaking with the timing or versioning that needed to happen, I would just be updating 2 keyframes, which would be a lot easier than updating 4. So I'm gonna undo that, no problem. And instead, what I'm gonna do is use parenting. So parenting is a cool way of using one layer to control, like a parent layer, to control a child layer. So this layer here, I'll call the child, and I'll use this little spiral, and I'll click and drag over to the title here to list. And now if I go back here, I can see that what it did is it just linked these 2 layers. Now let me explain parenting. It's very, very cool. I highly recommend you use it wherever possible. What it does is this parent right here, and you can see from the list here that it's selected this list layer. This list is the parent. That controls the position, rotation, and scale. It doesn't control opacity, but it does control position. So because I'm doing that, it's now pulling from here and it's all linked up. Now with parenting, you have to be careful, because what happens is the parenting starts in time where you start the parent. So for example, if I was halfway between this and I started the parent here, it would just, they'd be parented like that. Not that great. If I started it at the beginning here and I parented up, they're just now completely together. So what I want to do is I want to find that place in time, which is here, then parent, and now if I go back, you'll see that it's literally dragging it out. Now the other thing to keep in mind here with parenting is that with the parent, if I move this layer, it moves the child layer with it. But the child can be moved independently. So for example, if I didn't parent in time at the right place and I was like, and I started the parent here, and I was like, oh, you know, aw, dang it, like I messed up. No problem, I can just grab this child layer, move it back here, and try and get it to snap. Sometimes it's challenging to get it to snap. There. And now it'll be perfect. So parenting is great because now we've just done it with 2 keyframes. Okay, so now let's apply a little bit of easing here. So what you can do is click the position property, just the name right here, and this will make the keyframes blue. If I control click on these, I can go to Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. After Effects is bizarrely complicated when it comes to actually designing like easing. So like you have to do like 2 or 3 steps just to get it to ease right. It's super, super weird. I don't know why they don't make it easier for folks, but this is the process. So let me actually show you this in the graph. So if you click this little button here, it pops open the graph view, and it may look like this, like nothing there. So you have to click the property, and you may have to click it again to select it. So once it's there, you can see that this is linear motion. It's just a straight line, so that means the rate is constant. Down here, I can actually click on the like easing options. So I could just control click here and go Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease, or I could just click one of these options here and I can click the like Easy Ease. So what that does, that adds handles and it makes this a Bezier shape. So it means that it just has handles and like anchor points, and I can just click and drag these. Now, I'm not going to get into this a whole lot because this is complicated stuff, and you honestly don't need to know it that much, because there's a tool that'll just solve this for you, and you don't have to worry about this, because I kind of hate this view and with the handles, and it's just kind of wonky. But just know that if you click and drag these handles, well, let's play it first linear. So this is linear motion right now. You can just see it's just it just kind of thwacks. It's very, very boring. It's not cool. If I ease this, the default After Effects like easing is honestly pretty bad. Like you would never use it by default. It's just kind of sucky and you don't even really notice it. But what I can do is if I hold down Shift and drag this out, it now drags this whole thing out, which is really, really cool. And it changes the shape of the curve, and now you can see this actually starts to feel a certain way. It starts to feel eased. It starts to feel like a real product. It's very, very cool. So conceptually, I just want you to think about timing as a combination of duration, which is how close or far the keyframes are, and easing, like that little path that. It takes the shape of the path. So there's a lot of room to play with in here and to start experimenting. So a couple other things before we wrap this up is there's no real-time playback, meaning that it sort of does, like I'm like hitting spacebar, and it's playing back, and that's fine. You'll notice that this green bar here is what's called the RAM preview, and that is the real-time playback that After Effects generates. If I change things, and it's hard because these projects are so light that it's pretty fast for like After Effects to generate the RAM preview, but you'll notice that that green bar disappears, and then it reappears, and then if I hit the playback head again, it starts to rebuild that. So it's just slightly less than real time, but just keep that in mind that if you're working on bigger, more complicated projects, it can take like a minute or two to get going. Okay, that's just a pretty simple thing. And then lastly, to export your work, you need to render it. So just like if you're working in Sketch or whatever, you need to export your assets out to share that with your client team or stakeholders or for your portfolios. So the way we do that in like After Effects is we just render this out. So you can go up to your composition, add to render queue, and it pulls this up. Now I will say a couple things on rendering. So I'm just gonna cover the movie file rendering here. After Effects by default renders just a completely useless, large, like super uncompressed, massive file, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm just gonna leave the like settings here on lossless. Now you can go into this, but I recommend that you don't. And the reason is because like you can compress your stuff, like you could choose like a compression codec like H.264 or something like that, but really I recommend that you don't, because when you render and compress, it doesn't really use compression well, and the colors can get messed up, and also the file size won't be that great. So my workflow that I recommend, it's a little weird, but this is how I do it, is I render out with just the default like settings here. So I'll just re-add this again. So I'll go with composition, add to render queue, and if you click the name down here, this lets you choose where you want it to go and what you want it called. So I'll just call it here, and I'm putting it on the desktop, and I'll hit save, and then I'll hit render. And you'll notice that it's just gonna render the selection of where I was working here. It's not gonna do the whole timeline down here. That would be like too crazy. It's just that small piece, just fine. So if I go back to my desktop here, I have this file, and it's this huge file right here. And you can see that it's 63 megs. You can't really email that to your team. What you can do though is if you pop it open in like QuickTime, you can go File, Export, like 720p say. Now that'll make, and I'll just save that, that'll make a super small file. Look, that's 795K. That's amazing. You could text that to a person. That's really, really cool. And then I'll just delete this file here. So I know that's not like an ideal setup, but it's really the most professional way to do that. You can also use Adobe Media Encoder, can also do that for you. This is just the fastest, quickest, and dirtiest way that I found to actually do this. So I know, so I just showed you a whole bunch of stuff here. We've gone through this checklist, and there's other assets you can export, which could be like a GIF file or a JSON file, and I'll be covering those later on in this mini course. But I just wanted to show you the logical pieces of how to do this workflow, how to make it work, just to get your head wrapped around it. Now what I want you to do is, before I send you the next video, I'm just going to give you some homework, which is to just jump in and just maybe drag over a JPEG or whatever, and just start playing with the stuff that we covered, and just see where you get stuck, see where you get stopped, and then comment down below. And I'm reading those, and I can pretty much guarantee you that I know all the answers to all the questions you're gonna have. And so I'll be answering those questions as we go, and I'll be answering those in the next video as well. I just have a couple other notes I wanna make sure I get through. Oh yeah, so in the next video, I'm gonna address like the hugest source of friction, which is preparing your design file for animation in After Effects. So whether you're coming from Photoshop or like Illustrator or Sketch or Adobe XD, I'm gonna show you those workflows so that when you get into like After Effects, you can just start cruising and make stuff really fast, and you're not like pulling your hair out and being like, dude, what is going on here? Because if you don't do this step right, you're totally not going to be able to work with your files. So that's why I really wanted to remove that piece of friction for you. So keep an eye out for that like email from me coming up in a day or two. Yeah, make sure you comment. Let me know where you get stuck and your roadblocks and any questions you have about this. I know you'll get stopped. The whole point of why I wanted to do this course was so I could support you when you get stopped and you're trying this stuff out. So I hope you got some value from this. I'm really excited for you. This is a really, really cool thing. Let me know how it goes. And yeah, just keep an eye out for that email from me, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.